I'm Bob McGrath. I'm the Provost here at Stony Brook, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the third annual Stony Brook Human Evolution Symposium and Workshop. When Richard Leakey joined our faculty a few years ago, one of the ideas that he and I discussed was to create a forum for serious discussion of major events in human evolution among scientists whose views and opinions differ, often strongly. It was our hope that these workshops would help to define a research agenda that would help in making real progress toward a common understanding of the particular workshop topic of the year. This third Stony Brook Human Evolution Workshop brings together an international group of leaders from many disciplines to try to get a clearer appreciation of the major forces and events that shape the root of human lineage. The participants will work on questions such as: when did the human genus Homo appear? How can we identify its earliest members? What sorts of forces may have been at play to explain the emergence of our lineage with its peculiar features? As Provost, I'm very grateful to the workshop participants who are also presenters and panelists in today's symposium. The symposium lets students and colleagues from Stony Brook, as well as members of the public in the greater New York area, benefit from the presence of all these experts in human evolution collected here at Stony Brook. Now, during today's symposium, you will hear numerous references to the Turkana Basin in northern Kenya and southern Ethiopia, from which so many of the fossils critical to our understanding of early man have been recovered. We at Stony Brook are very excited to be working with the Leakey family to develop a permanent research facility at Lake Turkana, to enable year-round field research and education that will be called, and in fact is called, the Turkana Basin Institute. This symposium and workshop program is very much a private-public partnership, and I want to express my thanks to this year's sponsors, most of whom are here with us this morning: David and Maureen Acker, Kay and Frank Woods, Alan and Diane Rothstein, Edward and Frances Barlow, Bill and Kathy Cleary, and to the Wenner-Gren Foundation. These have joined with the university to bring this distinguished group of scientists to Stony Brook for this year's symposium and workshop. It's now my pleasure to turn things over to the convener of this series of workshops, Dr. Richard Leakey. He will introduce this year's topic, and then Richard will be followed by the organizer of this year's program, Dr. Frederic Green, who is also chair of our Department of Anthropology. Richard?
Well, good morning. I will be very brief as I get a second chance to talk after the coffee break. I really wanted to add my voice to the welcome that the Provost has given and say how excited I am to have an opportunity to see a number of issues that I've long been concerned about discussed. As many of you know, I left the active field of paleoanthropology many years ago to go into conservation and politics and various other stupid things that I've done with my life. And coming to Stony Brook was an opportunity to reopen an earlier chapter. The nice thing about it is I have no strong, well, perhaps that's not true, but no clear vested interests would be a better use of the word. And I can be a sort of a provocative backbencher in this discussion. And I would like to see a group of colleagues really get down to discuss some of the issues. I have long been concerned in the few meetings that I used to attend and other meetings that I've heard people have attended by the habit of people coming to meetings with a prepared position. They read their paper, the meeting is over and they go home, and we don't seem to make any progress on that. And I was of the view that we should go back to a type of meeting that was largely made popular by the Wenner-Gren Foundation many years ago, where the foundation used to invite a group of eminent people to go to a castle in Austria for a week to 10 days. They'd lock the gates, and the participants would have to spend the time talking to each other or sulking somewhere. But there was no way they could get out of the castle. There was no way they could make communication with anyone else. And those conferences turned out to be hugely successful in getting a real dialogue going on the progress that was being made, the issues that were of the day, and building bridges between people who, at least in the pages of Nature, had been pretty vitriolic about their colleagues' stance. We have failed to find a real castle here, but we have got a number of private homes where the owners have often offered to let us hold a retreat, and the symposium structure is to have a day like today where a number of invited speakers can set the scene, set the stage. There's a panel discussion about that, and most of those discussions will be sort of a little more structured and formal than they will be later in the week when we repair to the home of a very good friend, David and Maureen Acker, who have a home near here. And for the next 4 days, there will be no reading of papers, no prepositioned stances, and hopefully everyone can roll up their sleeves and after the first day of breaking the ice and being rude, at least in body language, if not in words, get to the next stage, which is to really discuss issues. The topic is an interesting one, the first appearance of Homo. I guess it's not really the first appearance of Homo in that it has a slightly religious sense that it came. It's really, what is it that we've conceived that suggests Homo is now in the record? In other words, we're looking for not the appearance of a fully formed entity, but we're looking for the traces that would suggest that entity is actually undergoing the sort of change and adaptation that later led to us. In this period, or this age, where religious fundamentalism has gained enormous strength, right across the great religions of the world, I am increasingly concerned that there's not enough being done to counter the argument that paleoanthropologists really don't know what they're talking about. I think we do know what we're talking about. I think the body of evidence is very strong, and I think where there are still open questions, we need to look at them and discuss them in a way that perhaps we haven't done for some time. I also feel that, and I talk about fundamentalism, because in recent months this has raised its ugly head in Kenya, where one of the larger Christian denominations, which have a church following of about 9 million people, they tell me, has posed the question, should the National Museum of Kenya exhibit fossils of early humans? And the point being made, and it's been made in the press by I thought he was an archbishop, but he turns out to call himself a pastor. I'm never sure of the ranking here, but he is the leader of this group. He said it's dangerous for children to be shown fossils because they might start to believe the story of evolution. Well, that is now in Africa. It is certainly in many parts of the United States and many parts of Europe. And I don't think, as scientists and as people looking forward, we can afford to be complacent about the inherent dangers of that anti-science attitude creeping out. And I really do feel very strongly that organizations like Stony Brook and many others, universities and many foundations, really need to be congratulated for taking a proactive position and encouraging events like this that are open to the public to put forward some issues. There's a lot still to learn, and of course we don't know a great deal about our origins. We know a great deal more than we did, and the first main speaker this morning will be Professor Tobias, who will be introduced by somebody else. But I would like to say that Phil Tobias I have known for a reasonable number of years, actually. We won't go into how long ago it was that we first met. And I guess he and I are probably the only living humans who were there when the earliest evidence for Homo was defined back in 1961 with the birth of Homo habilis. And although he calls himself a founding father, I guess I'm a founding great-grandchild. But we were there at the same time, and I remember vividly the excitement that story made then, and the excitement I feel today is that for the first time we probably can begin to look afresh at some of the issues that discovery raised. The increase in the number of sites has been phenomenal. The increase in the number of disciplines that are interacting together to understand some of these complex questions are such that the postulations made in 61 and 62 and 63 can now be taken forward with a lot more confidence. And I would urge that we try to focus in the next 4 or 5 days on the big picture. Let's not worry about the minutiae of this or that. Let's look at the real issue of the emergence of the forebears of what we are today, and be proud of what we know and be excited about what we can yet know with an integrated approach. So I won't say more except to repeat my welcome. We've got some very distinguished people to speak to you in the course of today, a very distinguished panel this morning and this afternoon, and I hope there's time for some interaction from the floor to really give this a good kickoff in what I think will be the most exciting conference we've organized today. So thank you, Provost, for hosting us, and thank you all for coming. And I hand over now to Fred Grine, who will introduce the speakers. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, Provost McGrath, Richard. I'm pleased to be able to welcome to Stony Brook a distinguished international group of scientists that work on the field of human paleontology and all its diversity. These individuals have come internationally from around the world: South Africa, Kenya, France, England, New Jersey, to join here for the next few days to talk about, as Richard and Provost McGrath said, the early Homo. This morning we have 3 keynote speakers, and this afternoon 4 keynote speakers that will talk about the subject of early Homo, and it's my pleasure and privilege to introduce to you the 3 keynote speakers this morning. There'll be Philip Tobias, Richard Leakey, and Bernard Wood. In the late 1950s, when the spectacular fossil discoveries were beginning to be made at Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania by Lewis and Mary Leakey, they sought out the expert services of Philip Tobias to assist in description and analysis of the remains. They couldn't have chosen more wisely. Born in South Africa in 1925, auspiciously the same year that the first Australopithecine fossils were discovered there by his predecessor Raymond Dart, Philip Tobias went on to obtain his medical degree in 1950, his PhD in 1953 for work on chromosomes, and was awarded a DSc in 1967 for his work in paleontology, all by the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. It was at Wits University that he was the head of the Department of Anatomy for over 30 years. I can't imagine that. Between 1959 to 1993. Now in his 80th year, Tobias this year published the first volume of a promised 3-volume autobiography. This brings to 33 the number of books that he has authored, co-authored, edited, or co-edited, as well as 600 publications in scientific journals. Among the more significant of these articles, as we'll hear in a few moments, was his publication in the early 1960s in Nature, where, together with Louis Leakey and John Napier, they named and described the earliest species of the genus Homo, Homo habilis. A long and brilliant academic career in South Africa, which saw Tobias as an outspoken and vocal opponent of the apartheid system, both as a student and as a faculty member at Wits, has been capped by the present government of the Republic of South Africa with the award of its Order of Meritorious Service. Then and again in 2004, his contributions to science and society were recognized by the Department of Science and Technology of the Republic of South Africa with the Philip Tobias Award. The first recipient of this coveted award was Sidney Brenner, a South African who was the 2002 Nobel laureate in medicine for his own work in genetics. I guess it comes around, Philip. Richard Leakey. Richard Leakey is a man who certainly needs no introduction at Stony Brook. Nevertheless, I can't pass up this opportunity to a captive audience. Born in 1944 in Kenya to Lewis and Mary Leakey, Richard decided at an early age he wanted nothing whatsoever to do with paleoanthropology. The mind boggles at what he might have accomplished in addition to what he's already done if he actually was interested in the field. Fortunately for all of us, however, his interest was somewhat piqued when in 1964 he began flying people and supplies from Nairobi into the lower Omo Basin of southern Ethiopia, where paleontological research was just getting underway. Flying up through northern Kenya, he noticed an area on the east side of Lake Turkana that looked quite desolate and potentially fossiliferous. In 1986, he undertook his first of many successful research expeditions to the area to become known as Kubifora. These expeditions are responsible for much of what we know about early human evolution in Africa. In 1972, Richard announced the discovery of the famous 1470s skull, which dazzled the scientific world and earned him and Homo Habilis the cover of Time magazine. Other spectacular fossil finds were to follow, such as the 1984 discovery of a nearly complete skeleton of Homo erectus. Richards was appointed director of the National Museums of Kenya in 1969, a post that he held for some 20 years until becoming director in 1989 of the Kenya Wildlife Service. And after that, as you know, he ventured into politics. Fortunately, he has come back to paleoanthropology. He has authored or co-authored at least 8 books and well over 100 scientific articles. Professor Leakey has not only been responsible for the discovery of some of the most spectacular human fossils to be recovered from Kenya, his interpretations of these fossils have oftentimes overturned some of our most cherished theories. For example, a single paper in Nature in the 1970s put an end to the long-debated single-species hypothesis. Bernard Wood. Bernard Wood is the Henry R. Luce Professor of Human Origins in the Department of Anthropology at George Washington University. Bernard obtained his medical degree in 1969, his PhD in 1975, and was awarded a DSc in 1996, all from the University of London. In 1985, Professor Wood assumed the chairmanship of the Department of Anatomy at the University of Liverpool, a position he held for 10 years when he became dean of the medical school there. In 1997, George Washington University was fortunate to be able to lure him across the pond. While Bernard was a final-year medical student, he joined Richard Leakey's first expedition to East Turkana in 1968. Holding to the tradition established by his parents, Richard sought out the very best to assist in the description of these fossils. Chose Bernard Wood as part of his team. Richard, like his parents, couldn't have chosen more wisely. Professor Wood has been closely involved in the description and analysis of the fossils, especially the crania, mandibles, and teeth that were recovered from Richard's expeditions from 1968 onwards. His work has resulted in the publication of over 150 scientific articles and 7 books, including the most heavily cited monograph ever produced on human fossils, his 1991 treatise on the hominid cranial remains from Kubifora. Indeed, I have it on good authority, and not from Bernard himself, that Bernard is the most heavily cited human paleontologist in the United States today. Not only do his fellow scientists read what Bernard writes, but unlike some of us whose occasional papers are largely ignored, people actually pay attention to what he says. Ladies and gentlemen, it doesn't get any better than having Philip Tobias, Richard Leakey, and Bernard Wood talk to us about early Homo. I'd like to introduce or ask Philip Tobias to take the stage. And speak to us on Homo habilis, a premature discovery remembered by one of its founding fathers 42 years later. Philip.
Thank you. Mr. Provost, Richard Leakey, Fred Grine, other colleagues and friends, ladies and gentlemen. It's been a long haul from Olduvai 1959, actually it goes back a little earlier, up to the present. But it was in that superb gash in the Serengeti plain of northern Tanzania that Lewis and Mary Leakey sought for 30 years finding animal bones, heavily fossilized, stone tools, but not the fabricator, the maker of the tools. Until one day, in 1959, when Mary Leakey lighted on the famous skull of what became Australopithecus zinjanthropus boisei. Now, we're going to start with the first slide, and I don't know if we can have a little... Can you see that all right? A little less light on the stage, please. This is the gash from which such a treasury of fossils and tools have emerged, the greatest of its kind in Africa. And it was there in July 1959 that Mary Leakey, that's Mary, here, came up with, or down with actually, a very interesting specimen which turned out to be the first part of the skull which was known as Dear Boy in the Leakey family. And here they are with that upper jaw, with its huge gargantuan teeth, in 1959 when it was first announced at a meeting in Kinshasa, Central Africa. And this is a glimpse of the skull that they invited me to describe, evaluate, study, restore in 1959. It was on the banks of the Congo River, actually, and I nearly subsided into the mud with astonishment at their generous offer. Well, that offer was a change in my career, because I had up to then been planning to work on the peoples living in Africa today. And I had done researches on the Kalahari Bushmen, the San, and on the Tonga people of Zambia, and this was going to be my life's calling. Lewis and Mary summoned me away from that, and more than my own chief, Raymond Dart, they set my feet into the world of fossils. He's so thin here, Richard, that I can't help wondering whether this is Johnny or you, but I think it's you because I think I took the photograph. In 1960, another member of the Leakey family, the eldest son of Lewis by Mary, Jonathan, at the site which Richard is here pointing out, brought to light some remains which didn't fit easily with the hyper-robust ape man, Dear Boy. And the jaw that came out of the spot which Richard was there indicating showed some remarkable features, long, narrow teeth, especially the premolars and first molar, teeth which overall were smaller than those of the ape man, and which in fine detail led us to think that this was very different from South Africa's Australopithecines and Deer Boy from Olduvai Gorge. But what was it? In the same area came another juvenile specimen, clearly belonging to the same individual. That seemed to be beyond doubt. It was a left parietal bone, almost complete, save for a little segment at the back in the middle, and the right parietal bone, well preserved in the back region, matching the back lateral portion of the left parietal, so there were actual points of symmetry, and these came out of the site. They were big, they were big parietal bones. Those of us like myself who knew the South African ape men had never found a parietal bone of the dimensions of this one. We were able, without much difficulty, to reconstruct the left and right parietals, and from these two bones, this is the one on the right side of the cranium and on the left side that meet in the middle line, these two I was able to piece together in Nairobi to make a biparietal arch. It was a new approach to the study of calvarial or cranial evolution, with a special reference to the contents. Once we were satisfied that we had a very nice, anatomically acceptable biparietal arch, we made an endocast which fitted snugly in the tunnel between the two parietals. My reasoning and Lewis's and Mary's, and also there was George Gaylord Simpson on a visit, the great American paleontologist, and his wife Anne Rowe, who sat and wrote down all the measurements as I took them. We were convinced that if there was such a large biparietal arch, the brain that those two parietals covered was a big one. But how big? So we made a partial endocast and took a reading of it by immersion 10 times and took an average, and then I did the same mechanism to find out how much of the total brain size must there have been given a capacity of this particular dimension. And so I used a number of other endocasts where there was a fair indication of where the parietal bones had come to. I made partial endocasts on those, total endocasts on the whole specimen, and got a percentage. And it's an astonishing thing that half of one's brain lies under the two parietal bones. Please, if you're a motorcyclist, wear your helmet. If you're not, cover your parietal bones if they're ever in danger. They're very precious. There's a lot of brain that they are covering up. And eventually, from that, I was able to find an estimate for the total brain size of something of the order of 670 cubic centimeters, nearly 50% greater than the range of values from South Africa, where we had an ape man called Australopithecus africanus, and also bigger by far than the robust chap called Dear Boy from Olduvai. Was something very peculiar about this large brain. There were people who said the child, the youth, must have had water on the brain, hydrocephalus, and that made the cranium so enlarged. Very interesting that one hears a similar kind of argument going on today in the light of the little single specimen discovered in Java, which also has a very odd brain size, considering it lived only, 17,000 years ago. And the pathology result is still being developed in that case. Well, that individual had these elongated teeth. Look how beautifully preserved they are. There is the enamel. There is the line where enamel meets the roots, what we call the cervical enamel line or cervical enamel line. Very lovely set of teeth. This was also a juvenile. It has got its 6-year molar and its 12-year molar, but the permanent molar was not yet evident. So this was a youth. The 2 parietal bones were of a youth, and we assumed they all belonged to the same individual. They were found in a small cluster, not as one of our colleagues, Professor Alan Walker, rather quaintly states, scattered over a large distance. This was not really the case. Now, one specimen does not a species make. I'm quoting from a colleague, Eric Delson, at the American Museum of Natural History. We need more specimens to show that one was not a freak. How do we know that those smallish teeth, long and thin, were not a freakish individual variant of an Australopithecus africanus? How do we know that the large brain size, large by Australopithecine standards, was not a freakish individual who extended the range of variation of the existing South African sample for the nearest related specimens? Well, to answer that, we needed more specimens. And sure enough, the Leakeys, ever on the job, went back to Olduvai, and there came to light Cinderella, Olduvai hominid 13, and she had a neatly preserved upper jaw and teeth and lower jaw and teeth with perfect occlusion between the upper and lower teeth. And these teeth, from a different place in the Olduvai sequence, showed the elongation of the premolars and the first molar, as was in Johnny's child, the first specimen. So now we had 2 showing similar dental features. The Calvaria which we were able to piece together, and I was helped on this part of the work by Ron Clark, working then for the Leakeys in Nairobi, and again we were able to produce a partial endocast. Where did it fit in the story? This one gave us an estimate of over 600 cubic centimeters, just as in the case of the child, Johnny's child. And then came George, Olduvai George from Olduvai Gorge. This is OH16, and although it was not in a very healthy state when found, because of a herd of Maasai cattle who had walked all over it, it was possible to piece it together and to make a partial endocast of this one also. And it too fell in the over 600 club, as I was now calling them. And so by this stage, there were late 63, there were about 5 specimens from different parts of bed 1 Olduvai and bed 2 Olduvai, which showed the same dental features. And 3 of them also showed a tendency to enlargement of the brain. It was beginning to look as though Leakey's hunch of 4 years, that's Louis Leakey's hunch of 4 years before, that there was a new species of Homo there, was correct. I had resisted for all those years. I wanted hard evidence and not just a kind of gut feeling. And this has led to quite an interesting misconception in the account of these fossils. Here we have the brain sizes, the brain endocasts from 3 of them. And it was at this point that the question of conversion came into the picture. How does one change one's mind in science? Conversion in science is just as real a concept as conversion in philosophy and theology. But a myth has grown up in the literature, and I'm going to just quote a little bit of that, because I was the sort of victim of that myth. Let me see. 9, 12. As far as I can trace, the first published source of the unlikely story was Sonia Cole's biography of Lewis, called Leakey's Luck. She states, Tobias had always been a little unhappy about creating a new name for it, but he had been swayed by Napier's conclusions on the manipulative ability of the hand. I won't read on the next part because it is quite at variance with the facts. Then she says, this argument, plus the strong pressure brought to bear by Lewis, had persuaded Tobias to associate his name with the creation of the new species. As one colleague put it, I've never found out who that might have been, Habilis had been launched mainly by the power of Lewis's personality. I don't believe that is true. He had a powerful personality. He was a fortissimo personality. He was a wonderful if frustrating person to work with. But then you pick up Don Johansson's and Maitland Edie's book called Lucy, and they put this question into the mouth of Tim White of Berkeley. Quote, "It's not like Louis Leakey hammering and hammering on Philip Tobias about Homo Habilis until he had beaten him down." I wrote to them and said, "Wherever did you come by that information?" And they replied, "Probably from Sonia Cole's book." And there was a third reference by Mary Leakey in her autobiography Disclosing the Past, where she says the specimen had to be Homo. Lewis directed his considerable powers of eloquent persuasion towards Philip Tobias and John Napier. In my large work, 2-volume, 1,000-page work on Homo habilis, published in 1991, I was able to show the real reasons for the conversion. I set the record straight. Firstly, my personality was not such as to be easily browbeaten into a certain standpoint. My individualism had stood behind me, as it were, in my 40 years long fight against apartheid and the inroads against academic freedom by the apartheid government of South Africa, but also to my scientific studies and interpretation. It is inconceivable that I would be browbeaten to a certain standpoint even by such fortissimo personalities as Raymond Dart, LeGros Clark, and Louis Leakey. Apart from personality traits, there are letters and records testifying at that time to the real reason, the different motivation for my conversion. I had been pointing out that there were differences between that habilis group from Olduvai, to anticipate the name, differences from Australopithecine anatomy. But I felt that I needed more evidence before I could take the plunge and accept Lewis's prior decision that this was a different species, a species of Homo. In August 61, Sir Wilfrid LeGros Clark at Oxford wrote to me and said, "What's your latest thinking? You haven't published yet. What's your latest thinking about these fossils?" And I replied to Sir Wilfrid, let's just pick a little bit out of it, "Until I can get down to my more detailed study of all these remains later this year, my view is that it is an early and rather large-brained member of the Australopithecines." 61. 2 years later, Sherry Washburn of Berkeley wrote to me the same question. He wanted to quote me in a book, a chapter he was writing. And I gave him my views, and they appeared in full in Washburn's chapter in Classification and Human Evolution, page 196 of 1963. And I could tell Washburn, "I do not think I have yet seen any features which individually or collectively place it outside the probable range for Australopithecus sensu lato." So for 4 years, the force of Lewis's persuasive powers had failed to bully me into accepting that OH7 should be seen as representing a new early hominin species. On the contrary, my own hesitation may well have given pause to Leakey, so that he did not name his suspected new species, but waited until more and better specimens were discovered. Lewis and Mary made this point clear in print Nature in 1964. But it was the new evidence that converted me. Fossil evidence, the hard facts of evolution. In 1963, we had teeth representing 5 individuals from 3 Olduvai localities, and they all showed the absence of what I had called the australopithecine bulge of the teeth, the premolars and first molar. They were smaller teeth, and they were elongate and slender. So we had 5 individuals from 2 layers in Olduvai pointing to this being something different. Meantime, Napier, to whom we had passed over the limb bones, when I found that I could not cope with the tremendous number of new things that Lewis and Mary were bringing to light, Napier, with his assistants, Peter Davis and Michael Day, had been analyzing hand and foot bones from FLKNN1 at Olduvai. And they concluded that there was a creature or creatures living there with hands and feet very similar to those of modern humans, Homo sapiens. Now, if the creature with the elongated teeth was the same creature with the modern human hand bones and foot bones, then we had something very interesting and suspicious. But we couldn't say it was different from the ape man from South Africa, because we didn't have the hand and foot bones of those creatures. And so it was beginning to look as though we were dealing with a population with 3 character complexes, all pointing consistently in the same direction. And then, as a 4th and critical line of evidence, I turned my attention in 1963 to the parietal bones and the endocranial capacity. Working with Alan Hughes in Johannesburg, my chief assistant, I made a new biparietal arch, a new partial endocast, and we were able to get a family of endocasts, all bigger-brained chaps from Olduvai. What an extraordinary concatenation of features we had at that time. The average for this little group, well, for Habilis itself, OH7, was 675 to 680 cubic centimeters. The average for Australopithecus africanus was 504 cc's, though later studies by Holloway of Columbia cropped this down to 441. In other words, the new group from Olduvai was bigger-brained, statistically significantly, than the ape-man brains of South Africa, and smaller-brained by a significant margin than the Homo erectus, the famous early Homo, the earliest Homo known up until that stage. Well, we now had 4 character complexes: brain size, hands, feet, teeth, in a cluster of specimens, all pointing to the existence of a population at Olduvai which was something new and excitingly different. December 63, Napier and I felt that we were able to recognize a new species at Olduvai. Lewis had long had the hunch that that was so. And in his characteristic way, he would say, look at it. It's obviously different. It's obvious a Homo. It's obvious and obviously a new species. And we were beginning to prepare our thoughts for a paper, joint paper, when suddenly exciting tidings arrived from East Africa. The Leakeys were doing it again. Lewis and Mary, in December 63, had found some more finds. And they arrived in Johannesburg in December with the new specimens. In January 64, I left for Nairobi to finalize my volume on Boisei and to study the newly discovered Olduvai specimens. With Ron Clark's help, working for Dr. Leakey in Nairobi, I made more endocasts and got more estimates, and it was now clear that this was something real, a population, not a single specimen, Pache Delson. It was a population representing a species. Let's have a look at some of these later finds. At this stage, I was converted by the hard evidence, and we decided it was a new species. We agreed with Lewis and Mary it must go into Homo, and we wanted a name for it. I asked Lewis and John Napier in London, let me speak to Raymond Dart, my old mentor. Here was a man with a remarkable facility for language, a man who had invented words like Australopithecus and osteodontocheratic. Monstrous sesquipedalian words, and with my heart in my mouth, fearing that he would come up with another such name, I said, we have some evidence suggesting that this creature was the tool maker of the earliest Oldowan tools of Olduvai, and it's set on the road to humanity. What should we call it? We believe we have evidence it should go in Homo and not in Australopithecus, the genus. He went away for the weekend, and I was praying fervently that he wouldn't come up with another of those monstrous names, and indeed he brought us the simplest, shortest, sweetest name that he had ever invented, Homo Habilis. Habilis, the basis of our words able, without the H, ability, There is even in English a word, habile, manually dexterous, proficient. A very suitable mellifluous name which we adopted. And our paper appeared in Nature in 1964, and then all hell broke loose. People had been writing to me saying, please don't let Lewis make a new species. As if I might have had any influence on Lewis, which is preposterous. Sir Wilfrid Le Gros Clark said in a rather long handwritten letter, I hope you will not allow Lewis to make a new species. And others wrote along the same lines. But they hadn't seen the specimens, they hadn't studied the evidence, and we had. And so the three of us, Lewis, Leakey, myself, and John Napier, took the plunge and published Homo Habilis in 1964. Even before our article appeared, as I mentioned, the pressures had mounted on us. And indeed, all sorts of people immediately rallied to the assault. Such names as Le Gros Clark, Kenneth Oakley, Bernard Campbell, David Pilbeam, Elwyn Simons, Clark Howell, Loring Brace, John Robinson. For those of you who are paleoanthropologists, all of these are household names. The opposition continued for nearly 20 years. Was Homo habilis ahead of its time? The phenomenon of delayed appreciation has been not uncommon. The eminent Finnish paleontologist Björn Curtain went so far as to declare practically all of the epoch-making discoveries of new kinds of fossil hominids have been received with doubts and opposition from most contemporary anthropologists. Now, this is very interesting, the phenomenon of conversion, the phenomenon of rejection, and Gunther Stent studied this for some pieces of research and showed that a discovery is premature if at the time it cannot be connected by logical steps, simple logical steps to the canonical or generally accepted knowledge. That's a better definition than just saying it's premature because it's before its time, which is a tautology. And I made a further study of the phenomenon and presented to the American Philosophical Society 10 case histories, including 2 of Stent's examples and 8 others, 2 of which came from paleoanthropology. Dart's Tong child, rejected for 25 years, and then acceptance gained. Homo habilis, our child, rejected for 16 to 20 years, and then gained acceptance from the end of the 70s and into the 80s. Next. I want to go straight on. We've run out of time. Here is the bombshell that came a few years later. This lady who looked rather bomb-stricken was Oldovi hominid 24, Twiggy, known as Twiggy to those in the family, and she had those same little teeth and the same big brain, about 600. And there's her brain, and one other feature, she was possessed of a brain stem, this is for the anatomists in the audience, which was further forward than that of the ape men, implying that these creatures were more adapted to going bipedally across the world than the ape men. And there is her foramen magnum, through which the brain passes to join the spinal cord. But then I started finding other things. It wasn't just size. The parietal lobe of the brain, represented in this endocast of Cindy, was asymmetrical, more strongly developed on one side and poorly developed on the other. There were there were qualitative differences. I'm so sorry. And then I found, and this was another bombshell, in 1973, I presented at Chicago the presence of two caps in the area of Broca's area and in the area of Wernicke's area, just above and behind the left eye and just above and behind the left ear. Habilis was the first hominin to show those bulges. And in 73, I presented that to Chicago. Nobody took any notice. In 1980, I took the plunge, and in a Parisian journal, on the 100th anniversary of the death of Monsieur Broca, they published my article claiming not only that it had the speech bumps, as Broca had called them, but that they could speak. This is the Oldovi family, 4 of them spread over the lower 2 beds of the Oldovi sequence. And then I think time is beginning to run out, Dr. Grine, but it's so dark down there I can't see you nodding or shaking your head. We have the same creature in South Africa. Here it is, one from Sterkfontein with the foramen magnum far forward as compared with Sterkfontein 5 with the foramen magnum far back. And we claimed this in 77. I quoted Cotain earlier, any new important discovery, expect a fight. But in 78, Clark Howell made pretty pictures in his remarkable chapter on the hominins in the big book on African fauna, edited by Vincent Maglio and Basil Cook. And this is Homo habilis, male on your left and female on your right, as reconstructed by Clark Howell. And it looks as though that is the end of the story. In that book, Clark Howell included Habilis as a good species and put a lot of specimens into it. A specimen that Noel Boaz had found with Clark Howell in Omo, up in the north to the north of Kenya, that was put into this. And it looked as though Habilis was beginning to gain a degree of respectability. And then in 1980, Milford Walpoff, in his great tome called Paleoanthropology, gave us what I regard as the quiddity of the transition when he wrote, Homo habilis is a taxon whose time has come. And that is a little bit of the history which led to this lusty youngster bursting onto the pages of paleoanthropology in Africa. Fred, you knew I was going to go over my time, but thank you for shaking your head in the dark and not in the light.
Engaging historical review by Philip Tobias. Now turn attention to a review by others who have also been instrumental in finding and analyzing all of the early hominin fossils that are put into the genus Homo. And the first speaker in this morning's post-coffee break session will be Richard Leakey, who will speak on early humans. Of whom do we speak? Richard.
Let me begin by saying that the title of my talk was originally to have been Homo Habilis, a Conundrum. And then somebody said, not everybody might understand what you're getting at there. So it was modified. And I'd like to begin by saying that the talk by my dear friend and mentor in many ways, Philip Tobias, I found particularly enjoyable to reflect and remember some of the events. And I think my father probably thought that he had successfully browbeaten you. But it's a trait that I've inherited from him, and that we think we've achieved something and go on the basis that we were successful. In fact, we made nowhere near the point we were trying to make. And so I think you're both right. You weren't browbeaten, but he certainly would have tried, although denied that he was trying. And I particularly liked your reference to a characteristic which I'm told I have, when he would pick something up and say, "Isn't that obvious?" And you would say, "No," which is what they say to me. But in his case, at least, and you had the great grace to say so, he was right. It had been obvious, you just hadn't noticed the obviousness. So for the family history, let me just give my dad a little support, which I was loath to give when he was alive, but now I find myself more inclined to appreciate his qualities, all of which were not admired. Secondly, as I said, or you said to me just now, you were very nice to me, or at least you weren't unnice to me. And I said, well, I will do the same, Philip. I will be as nice as I can, and I won't be unnice. And I have to say from the outset is that I both totally agree with the taxon Homo habilis, and I think you were right with John Napier and Louis Leakey to launch that species. But by the same token, I think some of the specimens that you have included from Olduvai still for me have a question mark. But if we go back to a legalistic point of view, the type specimen, Johnny's child, as you alluded to, the mandible and the parietals, which were the basis upon which the diagnosis was initially focused, and it was expanded to take in other specimens, that is Homo habilis, and I think it has remained Homo habilis, and I think it's correctly a new species of the genus Homo. My own involvement in naming new species is zero. I, as you know and others know, whilst I was active at Lake Turkana in northern Kenya and Kubifora, we found a great many fossils, and we published them fairly rapidly in terms of an initial announcement in the journal Nature, and subsequently more detailed descriptions in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology. And it was a policy decision in the early days that the group working on the hominids would not postulate new species, and that we would await either additional material or a chance to study them in greater detail. Subsequently, the group dispersed slightly, and we all went on to do different things, get new jobs, solidify our career chances. And some of the group, and one of them is here, Bernard Wood, strayed a little from that policy and started talking about species in the early fossils that we had, and named specimens such as 1470 and some of the other specimens to not Homo habilis, but to something I think I'm right, Bernard, in saying Homo rudolfensis. Others found it appropriate to name other specimens that we had discovered and not named, but had described, including the reference to a species called Ergaster. It sounds like a name that you were fearful of coming from Raymond Dart. I mean, Ergaster is a terrible name. It should not have been allowed, in my judgment, for a variety of reasons. However, Ergaster exists, rudolfensis exists, there are others that exist, and I think we do have a slight problem in terms of a conundrum, and I think in part the conundrum is driven by the incompleteness of a lot of the material upon which your early work was done. And I don't think anybody could argue the quality of the work that was being done in the 60s by yourself and your colleagues, but I think one could argue, and one still argues, about the quality of fossil upon the excellent work was being done. And I do find myself at this moment, and I'm Philip, you'll allow me, this is a public audience, and we have to develop some tensions here, some excitement. I do feel that the mandible and the parietals and the hand and foot bones, which formed the basis of the original study, and which were later added to with OH24 and OH16, these specimens are so fragmentary that some of our more erstwhile and creative colleagues, even today, could have used the same specimens to pursue other arguments. And I think that there is a weakness in that. Secondly, or additionally, not secondly, I would feel concerned that the stratigraphy and the chronology between these specimens at Olduvai is superb, but there clearly is a significant, maybe it's not significant, but there must be 150,000 years to 200,000 years of time separating Johnny's child, OH7, the type specimen, and OH13. And we know from hindsight, if we had known then what we know now, at the upper end of that span, around 1.6 million years, there are specimens both in Africa and now beyond Africa that are the same age as OH13 and which are clearly not what OH7 seems to be. They are more refined, and you might call them Homo erectus, or as some call them Homo Ergaster. And so had we known that the erectus-like Ergaster, or the African erectus, makes its appearance at around 1.6, 1.65, and had you then found a fragmentary skull at 1.6 million years in the middle of bed 2 at Olduvai at the same age of 1.6, one might have been tempted to include it in whatever Ergaster is rather than the Habilis. And so I think we have now quite a complicated set of finds in well-documented context, and the advantage of hindsight, we may now need to revisit some of this. I also feel, and I'll come back to this for the purposes of this discussion, that the efforts made to determine the cranial capacity of Homo habilis were faultless at the time those estimations were made. But when you're making an estimation of a cranial capacity and you only have the parietals and you are not sure what the complete would have looked like, it's difficult to know what the front end of the brain might have actually contained, because it might have been wider or narrower than the South African ape men or Australopithecines, and indeed what was happening behind the parietals in terms of that. Yes, I grant you that OH13 has the back part, but we also know that there are things that have now been found out of Africa that are quite small in terms of the back part that were clearly not OH7. So I think there is quite a complicated story. And I go back to my remarks when I was asked to speak at the beginning of the morning, and that I think that there's probably no other issue as important to the general public than the evidence for the first appearance, as it's usually referred to, for our genus. We are special, we are different, we are concerned, we are facing a very complicated future. The world is riven by all sorts of fundamentalist and other concepts, and if we can really pin down this issue of who we are and where we're from, once and for all, it would be very important. So I don't think it is trivial to revisit the earliest species of the genus Homo in this discussion, and inevitably, because the first publication in 1964 under that title was based on specimens from Olduvai, that at that time didn't have the benefit of many other specimens that have since been found. I think this conference will allow us, if we can step back slightly, to say, had the sequence of discovery been different, would Louis Leakey, Tobias, and John Napier necessarily have come to the conclusions that they came to? And this is not to say that they were wrong or made a mistake, but, you know, hindsight is not always, but is often clearer than foresight. And I think we lose sight of that too often in these discussions. So, as I said at the beginning, my task in part is to provoke a discussion around these issues. I am singularly impressed, and have always been, with what obviously impressed Louis and led Louis to make some of his, I think, early mistakes. And that is the relationship between the manufacture of artifacts out of stone and the anatomical changes that would be necessary to manipulate stone as a cutting instrument, and the brain that would be necessary to think about breaking a stone in a certain way to do that. And it is clear that at the time Homo habilis was launched, the oldest artifacts were at the same age as the oldest fossils attributed to the genus Homo, and that was at the lowest sequence at Olduvai, which is 1.79, 1.81 million years. Since then, and new discoveries are constantly made, the threshold for evidence of making stone tools has been pushed back to about 2.5 or 2.6, and certainly at 2.3 in East Africa, in Kenya, there's some artifacts that are very clearly quite sophisticated in the way that they were being made. And so there was something around that was fashioning cutting edge out of stone that was quite complicated. Were there several contemporaneous species making cutting edge stone tools, or do the cutting edges that are represented by the archaeological collection represent a single species, but regional populations of it operating under different raw materials and doing things in their own way? When we talk about a species, are we talking, and I think there is a real issue here, are we talking about a species A and a species B of Homo 1.8 million years ago to 1.6 million years ago, of which only one went on to become Homo Ergaster, Erectus, and maybe Sapiens? Or were there several and one or two disappeared for various reasons? But they were all of the same general adaptation, where they had shifted to a much more omnivorous diet where they could access meat through the use of cutting with a stone through flesh. These are important biological questions, and I think they're important adaptive questions that we need to understand in terms of ourselves. I think a more plausible suggestion would be that the adaptation of a slightly more complex, if not larger brain, the development of a slightly more manipulative ability, Habilis, Abilene, may only have happened once, and that this was expressed and manifested further in different parts of Africa in different ways, depending on other circumstances, rather than having it happened twice or thrice in one geographical area at the same time. That would be my simplistic view. But the great thing about this issue is that you don't know, because you can't find only one hominid. And when Lewis first discovered a reasonable hominid, or Mary discovered at Olduvai the first hominid, which was the Australopithecus zinjanthropus boisei that Philip showed you a picture of, he was convinced that he had found the maker of the tools. And the reason for that is that he'd been looking for 30 years with Mary at Olduvai for just that. He knew there were tools, and he knew that those tools had to be made by somebody, and when he found somebody, he assumed they made the tools. And it was in many ways a shock to him a year later, a year and a half later, when my older brother came up with something that clearly couldn't have been what Zinjanthropus was, because of the difference in obvious anatomy, not detailed studies. And therefore he had to do a slight change of pace and say, well, maybe this was the tool maker and this one ate that one. And so we got into a slight complication. But the same problem arises today. You find hominids and you find tools, and it's very easy, depending on your point of view, to say this one must have been the tool maker, or these were all tool makers, and you have to figure out how they relate to each other, but the tools are different. Are they very different? Are we different if we use computers to those people who are still using stone flakes today? What is that difference? We're all the same species. And I think species in the story of Homo, particularly in contemporary times, is obviously an important and sensitive issue that we need to think about. But let me try and, that's the wrong button, Fred. Which is the one I want to push? Sorry. And you will notice that these are all, or you wouldn't notice, but I will tell you, these have all been attributed to the genus Homo by different people in different ways. Do they all look the same, or do they all look different? And there's some there that have been attributed to Homo. No, the one on the right, 1, 2, 3 down on the right hasn't been attributed to Homo. That was a discovery made by my wife, Meve, and that has another new name, which she will undoubtedly talk about. But that's not Homo. But the others are, and some people would group these all more or less together. OH7, OH16, OH13, and OH24 are from Olduvai. They're not all there, but you have one of the Olduvai specimens on there that we'll have another picture of in a minute. So these are the early humans of which we speak, and it is the sorting out of these that seems to be rather important. Now, this is a human, my father, and just on a light note, I like to remind people that when I was growing up, my parents were working at Olduvai. I was in my early teens, and they used to go off sometimes with us, more often without us, to Olduvai. And they used to come back with the most extraordinary things. And one of the things that inspired all of us as youngsters was this giant mammal that you see the fossil of there. And this was thought by my father and others at the time to be an early sheep. And you see the modern sheep on the left, to which it was compared. And this was clearly a monstrous animal. We could only be shown the complete heads. And remember that the horn core is about 50% of the horn itself. So you can imagine an animal with horn cores as wide as those that my father's standing under, with horns on it of 50% more. These were magnificent creatures, and we imagined that the humans would be equally giant, and we had no idea how our parents were going to come back with these giants, these humans. And so we were very excited every time they went off to Olduvai to see what they would come back with. And we had this magnificent imagination of giantism in early hominids. And indeed, when they first found Zinj, which had these whopping great teeth, they called them Nutcracker Man, we felt that although it wasn't quite as big as we had hoped for, we were on the right track, and maybe others could be found that would be equal to that size. It now turns out it wasn't a sheep, it was a buffalo. And although it's a pretty impressive buffalo-like animal, it was wrong to assume that it's, well, oh dear, that went far too fast. How do I go back here now? Sorry. Anyway, I don't want to go back.
You don't want to go back?
I do want to go back. Oh, that's a different button. Okay, all right. Different buttons, okay, fine. This is Olduvai in the early days. My brother, you see, center of the table. He's sitting, helping himself to some lunch with my father on the left, Shirley Correndon between him and my brother, Matthew Sterling from the National Geographic Board of Trustees. This was in 1960, and my mother on the right. This was lunch or dinner at camp at Olduvai with the dogs underneath. My brother, I think he was 20 at the time, had been equally inspired and was down at Olduvai while he was looking for a job, I think secretly hoping to actually find this giant himself. And it was he who first lit upon the, oh, that's the wrong one, but I go that way, this mandible. And what he had discovered initially was a jaw of a saber-toothed tiger, the first at that time to have been found in East Africa. It elicited a lot of excitement, and in the process of looking for more of the tiger, as it was called, they came upon the need to excavate, and in the course of the excavation, this fossil of what Professor Tobias alluded to, of the pre-Zinj child, the premature or juvenile individual, which is the type specimen of Homo habilis. And it was on the basis of this that a larger excavation was undertaken, and in the course of the larger excavation they found the parietals, and they found remains of a hand and a foot. There has been, notwithstanding the acceptance of the mandible and the parietals as a single individual, there is still some question mark as to whether the foot and the hand are of the same individual, and I don't think that's easy to resolve, particularly as the hand bones don't appear to be quite as juvenile, nor does the foot. But this is an open-ended question, and as Philip said, there are very few hands and feet upon which one can base an argument, so they sort of get accepted this way or that way, and it's not a big issue. The Zinj skull that was found there's the habilis one, and one of the points I want to make, and I've made it before, but one of the reasons these fossils were so exciting was that they were the first fossils to have been found in Africa or anywhere else that could be accurately dated. And this is the letter that my father received from the University of California, in which the age was announced. And the middle paragraph says, Zinj and the pre-Zinj child are much, much older than anyone ever suspected, except perhaps you and Mrs. Leakey. The average age of the samples Jack Evenden and I have dated so far is 1,750,000 years. This was absolutely dramatic news, and these days we don't recognize just how dramatic it was. But these two fossils were older than 1,750 million, and it elicited huge interest and huge excitement. And in fact, it was the dating of Olduvai as well as the completeness of Zinj that stimulated international funding for this program and led to so much money being spent at Olduvai and later at other sites because of the excitement that this generated. Prior to the dating, a date of 250,000 to 500,000 years was assumed to be about right. And this sort of tripled the age of our ancestors. And as I said, was a moment of enormous excitement to everybody. You've seen this slide before, except that when Professor Tobias showed it, he showed it only the specimen on the left, and on the right we have the mandible, which is the same mandible but seen in occlusal view. And you'll notice what Tobias alluded to, these long, slender molars and premolars. A very distinctive characteristic it appears, of Homo, and one which was one of the 5 key points made in Tobias's work on the distinctiveness of Homo habilis. The interesting point that I would make is that mandible on its own is almost indistinguishable from mandibles that have been found at Lake Turkana at Kubifora of the same age, about 1.6 million years perhaps, and which have been called Homo Ergaster. And if we had only found mandibles, making one Ergaster and one Habilis would have been a very difficult thing to do. But it was done. And so you have identical mandibles, in anatomical sense, in 2 species living at the same time in one geographical region. I think some people would say, is that likely? And if it's not likely, what's going on here? And I think that's where, Philip, perhaps I think this conference may need to start looking at some of these questions. I don't think there's any doubt at all that the characteristics of the dentition, which you've alluded to and included in your definition of an early species of Homo, are appropriate. The question is, can one use them to separate Ergaster from Habilis, or are we talking about one and the same thing? This was the paper that came out in April '64 that Philip claims he wasn't browbeaten on, and I said I don't think he was, although my father thought he had. And that's the seminal paper establishing the new species of the genus Homo. And it was an exciting time. Now, this looks like a potato or a lump of lava, but this is OH 24. This is Cinderella, as found. And although Cinderella was able to pupate and come out, not Cinderella, Twiggy. This is Twiggy. Although Twiggy was able to come out of her cocoon there, one has to wonder what you couldn't make a fragment of such nature into. And I was wrong way. Here we go. And this is the same specimen on the left, still a bit squashed and crushed, and on the right, the sort of condition that it's now in which various pieces had been taken off and put back together again. A lot of plaster of Paris has been added, and this was included by Professor Tobias in his definition of what Habilis is. This is a specimen that is as old as the oldest at Olduvai. It's right down on the lava at 1.81 million years, and is clearly a critical find. However, a specimen that is that damaged raises problems, and of course the type specimen didn't have a face, didn't have brow ridges, didn't have the front part of the skull, and it's difficult to be sure exactly what it is. It wouldn't surprise me at all if this isn't indeed a small Habilis. I see no problem with that. The question is, can you get an accurate determination of brain size from a specimen that has been as badly beat up as this one, that has got as much plastic deformation as this one, and as much plaster of Paris added to as this one? I don't know. I think the Olduvai hominid 7 parietals that was found at Olduvai are much more difficult too, because, as I said, you've only got the parietals. So I don't think we can be sure that 675 is necessarily the age, the size of the endocranium. Those are the parietals that Philip showed, and you can see, although you can get a reasonable approximation of parietals, you've nothing in front and nothing behind. This is from Lake Turkana, Homo rudolfensis. You've got a calotte. You can make a reasonable endocranial cast. You've got a palate, and this was thought to be different from Homo habilis, in part because of the enormous size of the teeth represented there by these splayed roots. The cranial capacity on this was 750 more or less, I think, is the position that was taken. More recently, Professor Blumenschein has worked at Olduvai, and he came upon OH65. And OH65, I think, is at a level that is almost certainly the same age as OH7. Would that be fair, Rob? He's asleep. No, you're not asleep. Okay. And the interesting thing is those teeth are very similar to the classic Habilis teeth in OH7. And I think, Philip, you would agree, there's no question that's what we would expect to see in a complete palate. What I found very interesting, although the teeth are large-ish, they're not as large as you would expect if the wide roots of Rudolfensis, the 1470. If you actually look at the roots immediately below the crown, they splay. And if you break off the teeth at the level in which they're broken off in 1470, you're probably going to have 1470 with teeth very like these, which I think in itself raises the possibility that OH7 and what has been called Rudolfensis are one and the same thing, in which case you've got a creature that has a larger brain than 670, and it's probably around 750. And which way are we going? Then we go on to another Turkana specimen, 1813, which is on the top left, compared to what we called the African erectus, which has been called Homo Ergaster. These may be of a similar age. There's a dispute on at the moment as to whether they're the same age. It was originally thought that the 1813 was older, back at the same age as bed 1 Olduvai, 1.8. Recent work suggests it may not be, although it's not settled. If it's not, and it's younger, it would be about the same age as 3733 in the same area. Is it possible that 3733 and 1813 are one species? And if they are one species, could the difference between them be answered by the explanation that one is male, the bigger one, and the female is smaller? Certainly up in Europe, at Dmanisi, you have big skulls and little skulls, and they're all thought to be one species, and that would be consistent with this particular interpretation. This is the palette and other. It is the palette that has been found by Dr. Kimball, who is speaking to us during the discussions. And this is, at the moment, I think, recognized as the oldest Homo at 2.2 million years. Again, it's got relatively splayed roots and crowns that are not inconsistent with the one we saw from Olduvai and the squared-off palate. So at the moment, it hasn't been attributed to Habilis at all. It has its own species. We have Rudolfensis, we have Ergaster, and we have a mix of dates from about 1.8 at Olduvai, 1.8 at Turkana, up to 1.6, and a confusion there. So I would like to see that discussed in this discussion. So to pull this together, because I'm running out of time, I just wanted to say that the relationship between tools and hominids is very critical. The relationship between the first appearance of what we might call Homo is critical. What happens after that in terms of development of tools and human behavior in terms of campsites and things of that kind is going to be rather critical. I think we've got to accept that the hindsight value that we have today might require a modification of ordering. I know that there are people who will speak, and I know that Bernard, who follows me now, who was the author of Homo Rudolfensis and who has in many ways supported this complexity as opposed to the simplicity of a single species giving rise to something we call something else later, will have a different, possibly a different standpoint on this. But I think the purpose of the conference in the next few days is, having got it off our chests today, and possibly tomorrow morning, that tomorrow afternoon onwards, we actually put away our notes and put away our prejudices and actually start saying, well, let us go back to basics here and think of things in terms of not the sequence in which they were found, but the sequence in which they lived and the completeness of the fossils and the relationship. I think the archaeological record is going to be particularly critical. We have people here who can speak to this, but the evidence for the use of stone is pretty long now and pretty complex, and I think will be a very important insight into what was going on. And I think too often we deal with archaeology and we deal with the fossils and we don't talk together about what this may mean, and I think that's important. So my view is the Homo habilis story is indeed a very good story, but I think it's more complex than that, and I think things have been included in habilis that may not be habilis. They may be something later than habilis, and I think the sequential relationship between these fossils is very critical. Unfortunately, although we've spent an awful lot of time and an awful lot of money getting dates run on all these sites, there's still question marks about the temporal relationship between some of these fossils. And I think it's particularly true. We thought we'd got it all tidied up at Lake Turkana, but as more people look at things, the new questions are rising. It's too early to say what's right, but if there's a question mark, then in our discussion tomorrow we mustn't assume that we know the answer. And that, I think, is very, very critical to this. So thank you very much. I'll leave it there. Thank you.